morning, Year 5. We are going to begin at Chapter 3 today. We have left the end of Chapter 2, where Sir Walter has come home with Bess, and they said goodnight. And he said, "No, you don't need to call me Sir Walter, you can just call me Walter." Okay, Chapter 3. Living with a ghost has difficulties, I discovered, even if he is your friend. Of course I knew he would be as good as his word and not appear suddenly out of nowhere and frighten Gran half to death, but it was disconcerting, to say the least, not to know if he was in the room with you or whether he was listening in. It would be, he said, far too tiring for him to show himself to me all the time. And it was true that if he appeared too often and for too long, he would become hazy at the edges. It seems ghosts need time to recharge themselves, so to speak. So between us we had to devise a code, an exchange of signals. I would cough twice, that was to ask if he was there, and if he was, he would open a door or drop something on the floor. Much to my disappointment, he never seemed to use china or glass for this. More often it was a pencil or a newspaper that fell casually off a table, to Hump's great delight. He would pounce at once and carry it off in triumph, either to bury it somewhere or to chew it to pieces in his basket. But if I wanted Walter actually to appear, we agreed I would cough 4 times. It would work out well enough, we thought, just so long as I didn't develop a real cough. Of course, all this secrecy, all these signals were really more for Gran's benefit than anyone else's. I didn't dare think what might happen if she ever found out about Walter. But find out she very nearly did. She couldn't walk very easily because of her creaky knees, as she called them, and she couldn't see very well, on account of her reading too much in the dark when she was little, she said, but her ears worked perfectly, too perfectly at times, for it was Gran who said she'd overheard me talking in my room one evening. I said I must have been talking to myself. She's always talked to herself, Gran, said Mother, ever since she was little. Bess has been telling herself stories ever since she could talk, you know that. Yes, but then I heard a man's voice, Gran went on. Clear as daylight, it was. I probably had my radio on, I said. I'm quite good at thinking quickly when I have to. Well, it didn't sound like a wireless to me, Gran said, and luckily an argument developed as to whether a wireless should be called a wireless anymore, or whether it should be a radio or a transmitter. And the question of a man's voice in my room was forgotten. It was too close for comfort, though, so my friend Walter and I decided that in future we should talk in the house only in an emergency, and then always in whisper. As it turned out, though, it was Humph, not Gran, who proved to be the greatest danger. Humph seemed to be able to sense Walter's presence whenever he was in the room, and he would stiffen, hackles raised, and set up furious barking with intermittent thunderous growling. Once or twice he even bared his teeth, something that he had never been known to do before. No one could understand it. At first they put it down to the fact that Will was still away at camp, and that perhaps Humph was missing him. Mother became so worried she called in the vet, who examined Humph carefully and pronounced that he might have a middle ear infection, causing him to lose his balance and hear things that weren't there. So poor old Humph had to have drops poured down his ear 3 times a day. In the end, though, I managed to find a way round even this problem. I borrowed some scraps of meat from the larder and told Walter that the only way to Humph's heart was through his stomach, which was quite true. So now Walter would appear from time to time and offer some meat scraps, and of course as soon as he had him eating out of his hand. But I'm afraid this didn't work out exactly as I had intended. Now, whenever Humph smelt or perhaps sensed my friend Walter was anywhere near, he would wag his tail enthusiastically. Of course, that caused draught, which would make Gran's ankles cold, and so he'd often find himself inexplicably put out of the door. Poor Humph, it wasn't fair. Mother was delighted, though. With Humph's apparent recovery, and full of praise for the young vet, she went on and on about how clever he'd been in his diagnosis. Wait for the bill, is all Father said. Father seemed somehow preoccupied and sombre all this time, quite unlike himself. I thought it was because Will was away at first. They got on like a house on fire, those two. They laughed at the same jokes, and were always off rabbiting and fishing together. He liked me too, of course, but not quite in the same way. I always wished he would. I didn't mind quite so much now, because I had a friend of my own, and what a time we had, the 2 of us. It was like letting a bird out of a cage. Walter wanted to see everything, go everywhere, and do everything. First he wanted to go fishing, so I lent him Will's fishing rod, and we spent long hours together down by the river that runs through the marsh field at the bottom of the farm. We'd be alone there. Just so long as I kept an eye out for the horrible Barrowbills, we could talk freely. The Barrowbill brothers, identical twins, farmed on the opposite side of the river. The horrible Barrowbills, we always called them. Horrible because they were always shouting as if they found us on their side of the river. They even fired a shot at Humph once to frighten him away. But horrible or not, they never came near Walter and me. Once Walter had mastered the complexities of Will's reel, he fished like an expert, delighting in every catch and cursing his devilish luck. If he ever let one off the hook, that wasn't often. He built a small fire and cooked 2 of the fish in a hot ashes for me. I tell you, nothing ever tasted that good to me before, but our fishing expedition got me into dangerous difficulties at home. It came as a bit of a surprise to Father when I brought back a bag full of sea trout. "What's come over you, Bess?" he said. "You've never shown any interest in fishing before." I could tell he was quite impressed, and it seemed for a moment to lift him out of his gloom. "I'll come down with you one night," he said. "River's just right for sea trout. Shy fish, your sea trout. Best go after him in the dark, but I'm a bit tied up just at the moment." And I saw glances exchanged between him and Mother. Something was wrong. I knew it was, but I had neither the time nor the inclination to worry about it. I was far too busy looking after my friend Walter. Next, he wanted to go riding. He insisted on it. I did my best to discourage him because Sally hadn't been ridden for a while and she would plough a bit with an inexperienced rider. "She could be awful wicked," I said. "She'll run away with you if you're not careful. She's done it before. And what if the horrible Barrowbills see you anyway?" "You forget that we spirits have our ways," he said. "All that they see is a galloping horse. They'll not see me, not unless I want them to. And I know not show myself to anyone except you, remember?" Walter showed himself more often these days. He said he found the country air invigorating, that it didn't tire him so much to show himself now as it had done back in the tower. So no one saw Walter riding out on Sally except me. I saw them both as they thundered past through the high thistles, with Walter bent low over Sally's neck, his cloak whipping about behind him. Herons and ducks lifted off in alarm as they galloped towards the river, and I could see from the way Sally moved that she was enjoying being ridden. She was collected and controlled. She was being ridden by a real horseman, and she knew it. Afterwards we swam in the river together and lay on the bank in the sun. Walter smoked his pipe and he talked and talked, as if he'd had no one to for 100 years. "I've had an eternity, cousin, an eternity now to think of the errors of my ways, and they were many, many unforgivable. I see now, dear cousin, and for the first time too, that my gravest error ever was to leave the farm on the countryside." "Why did you leave then?" I asked. "I did not wish it," he sighed. "I was sent away from home, as were all young men of rank in those days. I went to Oxford first, but I cared neither for books nor of grey men of the cloisters who were my tutors, and I left for the wars. And that's what a young man did if he wanted to make his mark in the world, and I wanted to make my mark, cousin." "What do you mean?" I asked. Walter wasn't always easy to understand, and he seemed to know it. "I speak of ambition, cousin. Walter Raleigh had to be great in the land. He had to be powerful and rich and admired, and to be that he had to go to court. And so I went to court and was noticed at last by good Queen Bess, Queen Elizabeth, and she favoured me with her love and her attention." "Was that when you spread your cloak in the puddle for her?" I asked. He nodded and smiled. "That was the start of it, I grant you. I was always one for a grand gesture. So I became captain of her guard, and was soon rich beyond dreams, and powerful almost as the Queen herself. Truly, cousin, the world was at my feet. Then I met and married Bess Throckmorton, your ancestor and my dear wife, and she won my heart. She was suddenly more important to me than all the world, all of the gold, and all of the glory, but the Queen would not have it." "Couldn't you marry who you wanted to?" I asked. "Aye. So long as the Queen wanted it too, and she did not want it. I think she would not have minded if I had not loved Bess so well, but she knew I did, and that made her mad with me. She sent me to the Tower." "Is that why they cut off your head? Because you married someone she didn't like?" Walter laughed. "No, sweet cousin, no. But I was never again to be so high in the esteem of my Queen, nor ever again so high in the land." "So why did she cut off your head?" "'Twas not the Queen that destroyed me." His brow lowered as he went on. "'Twas the monstrous king that followed her, King James. He it was that had tried for high treason and condemned as a traitor Walter Raleigh, a traitor? His eyes blazed. And 'twas this same villainous king who robbed my family of all we had. He it was that took away my lands and my farms and my estates, even the jewels of my fingers. Yet I blame myself as much as the king, for there was more pride in my head than wisdom, and right it was it should be struck off, for I had grievously mismanaged my affairs through a mistaken belief in my own invincibility, a belief that led not to riches but to the death of my son, my dear Wat. He was a rebellious boy and argued much, but I loved him none the less, and 'twas I who caused his death. And he turned his head away from me to wipe his tears. What do you mean? I asked. They let me out of the tower only because I said I knew of a gold mine in Guiana that would fill the king's coffers. That's what the beefeater said in the tower, I said, but he did not seem to hear me. I knew where the gold mine was, but by the time I reached Guiana, I was too ill to lead the expedition, so I sent Wat in my place. Or what? What in my place? W-A-T. What? And the Spaniards were waiting for him in the forests. They were informed, I tell you. Cousin, and by no less a person than the king himself. I know it to be so. They ambushed my men and came to my son, and my son came to his death, our expedition to its failure, and my life to its miserable end on a scaffold. He shook his head and sighed deeply. Dear God, I can scarcely bear to think of it even now. So you see, cousin, where vain ambition leads, I should have stayed on the farm where I belonged. But look! He put his hand on my arm. A heron circled above us and came in to land at the water's edge, not a stone's throw away. As he watched him stalking stiffly through the shallows, a kingfisher flashed past us and was gone again upstream. Such wonders as these I'd almost forgotten, he whispered, and the heron lifted off and lumbered into the air. And it was not only the wild creatures of the farm that he found such joy. He made a collection of many of the plants and herbs and flowers he found about the farm, though at the time I did not know why. In the warm summer evenings, he would walk with me through the fields of humming clover, amongst the sheep and the cattle, and recall his own days as a boy on the farm. The fields were bigger now, he said, and there were fewer trees, and he could wish the river was clearer again, and the meadows full with wild flowers as they had been once. But that apart, it was much as he remembered it. I showed him how much I liked to follow the butterflies, and he loved it as much as I did. We followed one red admiral for a whole afternoon once, before it jolted up with a dozen others on a bank of nettles. After that we couldn't be sure which was ours, and we lost it. He was fascinated too by the farm machinery, the mower, the 4-furrow plough, the baler, the hay elevator, and the corn drill. He wanted me to explain the working of each one, and I found that difficult, for although I loved driving the tractor, I'd never much interested myself in how the farm machines actually worked. It was the tractor in particular that took his fancy. If I do nothing else remarkable in my life, it will be enough to claim that I, Bess Throckmorton, taught Sir Walter Raleigh to drive a tractor. Cars, he said, were but insects compared to the majesty of a tractor. One misty morning I drove the little Massey Ferguson 125, the only one father would let me drive, to the little meadow below the wood where no one could see us, and Walter climbed up into the seat. I showed him what was what, and off he went, his laughter ringing above the chugging and spluttering of the engine. He made figures of 8 through the long grass, and then rumbled away down towards the gates to the marsh field and the river beyond. I called for him to come back, for the horrible Barrowbills might well have been fishing on the far bank, and to them or anyone else the sight of a tractor driving itself along might be a little upsetting. Not that I minded upsetting the Barrowbills, but there were bound to have been telephone calls and questions and difficult explanations. Anyway, Walter obediently turned round and at full throttle bore down on me, his black cloak flying out behind him. It occurred to me for a moment that he might forget where the brake is. He might be expecting the 125 to rear up on its hind legs and paw the air and whinny. He was riding it just like a horse, but he stopped it in time and patted it on the chimney. I took all my persuasive powers to get him off so that I could drive it back to the sheds, but in the end he rode up beside me on the step and laughed like a boy all the way home. We made hay until dark that evening, all of us there, Mother turning and Father bailing, and Walter and me standing up in the castles of the 4 in case of the rain. Gran kept bringing out the orange juice and the tea and the buns, and grumbled about her creaky knees. She could be an old misery sometimes. And Mother kept calling me not to lift the heavy ones, Bad for your back, she said. They're lighter in the middle of the field. I'll manage the wet ones along the hedges, but of course we need not have worried, for I had all the help I needed that evening. Hay bales have never felt so light to me. You're working well, Bess, Father called out. We'll make a farmer of you yet. And I glowed inside. I had a sudden longing to introduce him to my friend Walter. I wanted very much them to like each other, but the secret is a secret, and I knew it. I was hot, and I was dusty, and I was tired, but at that moment I was happy as any lark. Why is it, though, that the good times never seem to last for long? Will returned home later that night, and came and sat on my bed and talked about the miles they had tramped, the mountains they had climbed, the secret cigarettes he had smoked, and all of Peter Munns from the school who had fallen out of a tree and broken his leg, and how it served him right anyway. But to be fair to Will, it wasn't him coming home that spoiled everything. To be honest, I was quite pleased to have him home again. He kept everyone happy and he made everyone laugh. Even Father cheered up a bit. I don't like to admit it, but if truth be told, we need Will in our house. He's the glue that sticks us all together, if you know what I mean. Did you go to that party with Aunt Ellie? He asked, after he'd finished telling me about his camp. Went to the Tower of London, I said. See the crown jewels? Wicked, aren't they? I saw the bloody tower, I said, where Sir Walter Raleigh lived. He's a distant relation of ours, you know. Relation? Ancestor, then. How do you know? Auntie Ellie said. So did Miss Soper. Who's she? A cousin of Auntie Ellie's. I done him in history. Who? Walter Raleigh. When we did the Armada at school, had his head cut off, didn't he? Traitor, wasn't he? No, he wasn't. Well, they cut off his head, didn't they? Must have done something wrong. They shouldn't have done. He didn't do anything wrong. I might have said more than I meant to if the argument had a chance to get going, but it didn't. There were sudden loud voices downstairs in the kitchen. We looked at each other, Will and I. I could hear Father banging on the table and shouting. What's up with them? Will asked. Arguing about Gran, are they? It's true that Gran was the only thing they ever argued about, and that was rare enough. Don't think so, I said. Father's not been like himself. Something's wrong, I think, but I don't know what. I had a sudden tickle in my throat. It must have been from the hay dust. I coughed twice. My blue elephant fell off the chest of drawers and landed at Will's feet. I spoke without thinking. I didn't mean it like that, I said, and then I clapped my hand to my mouth. Didn't mean it like what? Will asked as he picked up the elephant. What are you on about? And he pulled the elephant's trunk and tied it in a knot like he always did. Nothing, I said, bouncing out of bed and snatching it out of his hand. Didn't mean nothing. But Will was canny, and he knew when I was lying. He always did. You're up to something, Bessie, he said, looking around him. What little mystery have you been hatching up in here while I've been away? Nothing. I don't know what you mean. We'll see, he said, and went towards the door. He stopped and sniffed the air. Smells of tobacco in here. You been smoking, have you? I shook my head vigorously. He sniffed again. Funny, he said. And there's another thing. You've been down in my chemistry lab, haven't you? No. You sure? Of course I haven't. I hate your smelly chemistry lab. Anyway, I never go down to the cellar. I'm frightened silly of the spiders. You know I am. He seemed to accept that. Well, someone's been down there. That's all I know, he said. Someone's been down there messing about. I know they have. Well, it wasn't me, I said, knowing quite well who it was. Who else could it have been? Will seemed satisfied with that, and he went out, leaving the door open. He always left my door open. I shut it and listened just to be sure he was gone. I coughed 4 times and nothing happened. Not at first. You there, Walter? I whispered, and he appeared just where I thought he was, sitting at my chair. He seemed to like my chair. It was you, wasn't it? You've been down in his chemistry lab, haven't you? Why? What for? He held up his hands and chuckled. I confess it freely, Chick, he said. I like it when he called me Chick. You must excuse me, but I have a passion for a knowledge of science, and for chemistry in particular. I was a man of science in my lifetime and did many experiments with plants and herbs, and though I say it myself, I was not entirely unsuccessful. Science to me is like the world. There is much to explore, much to discover. One gains such paltry slice of knowledge in just one lifetime. He bowed his head. Your pardon, cousin. Henceforth I shall not indulge myself without greater caution. That much I promise. It's not going to be easy now that Will's back, I said, and you'd better stop smoking in the house. He's suspicious already. I know he is. If you say I must not, then I will not. He's cunning as a weasel, eyes in the back of his head, I said. What weasel cannot see a weasel cannot... What weasel cannot see a weasel cannot catch, said Walter. Do not trouble yourself, sweet Bess. All will be well. But I knew my big brother Will a lot better than he did, and I wasn't quite so sure. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 3. So I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 4. Goodbye.